This is Robb with Disrupt Ed TV, and I'm excited today to be joined by Rick Wormeli from Herndon, Virginia, to have a conversation about assessment. Rick, welcome.
Thank you, Evan.
Really excited to have an opportunity to have a conversation today. Before we start our conversation, I would like to share a little bit with our viewing audience about you. You have an extremely exciting background, a lot of things that you are considered certainly an expert in. It's an honor for me to be speaking with you here today. You have over 39 years experience as a classroom teacher, and also you currently are an educational consultant. You speak in the United States of America and you speak all over the world. You've written 9 books, and I encourage our viewing audience to check out all of Rick's books. My favorite book is Fair is Not Always Equal, and a new edition of that has just been produced. And there's another book coming out by Rick from Stenhouse this coming December that our viewing audience can look forward to. Rick, you're an expert in many things, but a particular interest to me is your expertise in assessment and grading, differentiated instruction, educational leadership, just to name a few. And I'll also throw in your knowledge on homework. You live in Herndon, Virginia, and you can be found at Rick Wormeli 2, numeric 2 on Twitter, and your website at rickwormeli.com. So again, Rick, I welcome you, and I thought today we'd have a conversation about a topic that I know is very near and dear to you, but also certainly to people that are watching this video. We'll talk a little bit about redos and retakes and their role within a classroom, especially now that a new school year is starting, and this is a great opportunity to get our viewing audience to reflect on grading practices and how they might change for the upcoming school year.
Yeah, that would be wonderful if we could really get people to dive into the conversation. And that's kind of the harder part is, you know, when you've been doing something for a very long time and it's associated with what you do, you think it's effective, but you really haven't done the deep diving to analyze what's really going on. And then somebody comes in and says, well, I'd like to suggest something alternative. That can be very confrontational at first because your identity was all set up with the way you used to do things. And now you're asking me to kind of change who I am as a person by taking away something that I thought was legitimate. But I think that's, you know, that's really part of being a professional is a willingness to revise in light of new perspective, you know, and new evidence as it comes up. And I have to tell you, I have never had anybody who, once they got into reiteration and the descriptive feedback, the relearning and the results of all this stuff, and the comparison to the larger working world, who went into it cynical, kicking and screaming almost, who once was there, ever want to return. The problem is broaching the topic, you know, really kind of getting into something that is so sacrosanct for so many decades, you know, in so many faculties. But one of the easiest things that we found is let's take a look at how anybody in any field is ever trained. So EMTs and police and architects and nurses and just really everybody in any profession, and you find evidence of the reiteration and then correction. Somebody gives the feedback and then you're a little bit better next time, and then you invite the critique and then you're a little bit better next time. So the question then becomes, are teachers willing and principals willing to ask the larger questions like, what do you really want kids to do? And most teachers would say to learn the material. Some would also say to grow up. To mature. Sure. Like, great, we can do both of those by going through that redo process. What is a false assumption that we really have to put out there and reveal it, put it in the light of close scrutiny, is that the label for failure, you know, you used your time poorly, F. You didn't meet the standard, 0. And making that unrecoverable, that there's this idea out there that actually teaches, that actually matures, and it doesn't. So we look at the research about what leads to student success in terms of they learn how to meet deadlines, they develop self-efficacy, they learn to get back together, they build moral fiber, they task analyze, they start the project on the day it's due, and that all comes anecdotally, let alone, you know, research-based, from going through the relearning / reassessing process, not by being slapped with an F and saying that it will learn you. So I'm hoping that people will be willing to dive into the conversation, and we can get real specific, but there are 2 sides of it. 1, how do we rationalize and get comfortable with that? And 2, how do we pull it off so that kids do mature and learn from it and we don't lose our sanity?
I want to talk fabulous. It makes me think about, and you talk about this in some videos that I've seen from you before, about a grade book needing to be fluid and taking some rigidity out of the assessment process. I have read some of your work before where you point out that many of the major tests that we take in life, whether it be an LSAT, a GRE, or driver's license test, you can redo them. And sometimes, and I know from my personal experience when I was a student that some teachers would put some sanctity around their quiz, and it was either you got it or you didn't get it.
Yeah, now that's a really interesting thing. I mean, quizzes bring up another controversial issue in this whole sequence. For example, a lot of teachers, myself included, earlier in my career, the quiz would count 10% or 20% or whatever it was. Labs would count 25% in a science class, something like that. But we have to begin to realize, what role does a quiz play in the learning progress, in the learning journey, in the lesson design, the overall sequence? What role does a lab play? What role does homework play? And a quiz is really a status check of where you are right now in the journey. And from that, we will take data and adjust learning in light of that, but we'll keep on learning. The only time it really matters, where the rubber hits the road, is that unit test at the very end. So if you really were living up to the promise and you were truly ethical and trying to make the grade very accurate, quizzes will count 0. They wouldn't count 10% because they're supposed to be low stakes but high feedback, so we can use it to kind of gauge where to go next. And no teacher would ever allow an earlier report of incompetence to be included in the current report of competence. Before, I wasn't very good at that teaching strategy, but now I am. But when you evaluate me, it's based on today's evidence, not yesterday's evidence, because you trust the assessment instrument to be a valid indicator of accurate proficiency. So when you're looking at, all the overall experience of the learning cycle, taking quizzes, getting feedback, and so on, you begin to realize, are you ruining the instructional value of the very thing you thought was so valuable? Are you out for gotcha? I caught you making mistakes and I pointed it out and documented it, in a false sense that actually teaches and builds maturity? Or you have to make sure the child actually learned the material. And in our own development, we would not be here if somebody did not give us recoverability and assess and teach us to engender hope rather than dismissing it and playing gotcha. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And I know you talk a lot about making sure that hope is something that's preserved in the classroom. And it brings us a little bit shifting to a discussion of averages. And as you alluded that if a quiz grade is poor, but a student has interventions, they have support, they learn the material, but let's say on a couple of the initial quiz grades, student made an F, or even let's say the student made a 0. But through some additional interventions, some time, opportunity, and effort, when the student takes the summative assessment, they do well. They make an A or a B on that assessment. And then so the question is what is the accurate representation of this student's knowledge? Is it found in the summative assessment, or is it found like exists in many classrooms across America through an average? And if it's found through an average, it may not actually communicate the correct understanding that a student has of the material.
Yeah, and that's where you want a colleague to be really good at cognitive coaching and come up to you and say the bigger questions that we all should be asking, but we're lost in the myopia of the moment, the urgency, and we forget the larger questions. And so I would hope that somebody would say, hey, Rick, I noticed you're averaging an earlier incompetence report with a current report of competence. What do you think? Do you think grades should be accurate? Yes, I say. Good. Then what you're doing is distorting the accuracy of the grade. Oh, then Rick, which one has a higher correlation with outside the school objective testing? Which form of central tendency, mode, mean, or median? Oh, it's not mean. Mean actually distorts that correlation. Good. So, hey, Rick, teacher, in this situation, do you want to have integrity? Do you want people to be able to trust the grade to be an accurate report of student proficiency and be used to making decisions and so on? Yeah, good. Then what you would do is you would do actions that move towards that. But what we really needed is that colleague who cared so much about us and our students that they would ask the candid question and get us to kind of walk those paths, not just say, you were wrong and let me prove to you how you're wrong. So I'm a really big believer that there shouldn't be just the instructional coach or cognitive coach in one school building or maybe 2 or 3. that everybody should be trained in that cognitive coaching, where we help people just kind of self-analyze, and that become a valuable thing. I got to tell you, I'm nationally board certified with the National Board for Professional Teaching Standards. I was in that very first group, and it's been invaluable to become the reflective practitioner rather than just trying to survive the day. And you never really take a moment and sit back. So if there was structure and impetus for teachers to sit back and analyze what they would do, I think we could clean up and we could make far more ethical and efficient our grading policies in America and around the world.
Yeah, it's a really powerful statement. You know, grading is one of those things, certainly from my perspective as a principal, that people may not have gotten a lot of experience when they went through preschool.
Yes, that's why I wrote my book.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so they bring their own perspectives. They bring how it was done when they were in school, a particular
Right.
that they may have actually liked, and maybe they had a great experience in that class, but doesn't mean that, kids.
No, it doesn't mean it's actually positive because you're right. But that brings up another issue. It was really good for me, and I'm okay as an adult. So are you saying I'm not okay as an adult when you tell me the way I grade, which is just the way it was done to me, is not okay? What we just heard there, and it happens a lot, is ego got in the way of accepting a new idea. So the idea that we make educators, principals, teachers, paraprofessionals, doesn't matter, very aware of the role of fear of embarrassment, like Thomas Newkirk's wonderful new book, Embarrassment, I highly recommend. The specter of humiliation, the social side of school reform and change from Robert Evans and so on. They were very mindful of what is going on in that dynamic in a teacher's mind and sensitive to the fact that I might have to give up an idea and that just really bothers me. And I don't want to dive deep because I might find what I was doing is less effective than my ego thought it was.
Really interesting. You know, I find that, you know, and this certainly exists within me too, that we all have a Linus's blanket, and sometimes
right.
it is comfortable and it's something that you don't necessarily want to let go of. But oftentimes letting go of it is quite liberating. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah, it could be liberating at first, but also acceptance can sometimes be sad and not always happy. And so we just want to honor that journey and the other people around us, because they could be at different points, different frames of reference. And we don't want to judge too harshly because we've been there before.
Yeah, absolutely. Rick, this brings to a close our great conversation, which I really appreciate having with you. I appreciate all the insights that you shared with our viewing audience. Is there any message that you'd like to share to the teachers across America or administrators as a new year is about to begin?
Wow. Well, I guess I'll say this. Every year that I'm in the classroom, and certainly out of the classroom as well, I always make a promise to what am I going to unlearn this year? Something that with which I've grown very complacent and I've not questioned it. It's gone unquestioned, unexamined, because I'm so mindful that a critical examination of pedagogy elevates, whereas an uncritical, unexamined pedagogy harms.
Absolutely.
So is there something this year that you could proactively unlearn in yourself and not feel diminished by that, but feel refreshed and rejuvenated by that discovery? That might be something to put on the radar for the months ahead.
Excellent. I'll certainly work on that myself. Rick, I thank you for having a conversation with me today. This is Evan Robb with Disrupt Ed TV, reminding you that if you want to bring innovation and creativity into your life, at times you need to disrupt your routine.